Welcome everybody. My name is Magnus Dahl. I work for the Nordic Chamber of Commerce in Indonesia. And I'm very excited about this event today with Lars Wittig from IWG Group about the future of work. It's a topic that I'm very interested in personally, and I think it's on the top of everyone's mind in some way or another these days. I'm sitting in our office here in Spaces in South Jakarta in World Trade Center, and very happy with Spaces because they have this worldwide access, so you can get access to the co-working spaces all over the world. I've been using it back in my hometown in Oslo, in Singapore, and around the world. So it's a very good concept. Just wanted to say that briefly, without being requested to say that. I just wanted to share it. So Lars Wittig first moved to Asia over 30 years ago, when I was still climbing trees and playing around in sandboxes in the outskirts of Oslo.
Who says I wasn't doing that?
What did you say?
Who says I was not doing that too?
He worked for Coca-Cola as marketing director in the Philippines, Dula Packaged Foods as marketing manager Asia, Hawaiian Tropic as marketing director Asia Pacific, and the East Asiatic Company Japan as marketing manager, EAC Distributors in the Philippines, establishing new distribution for Philip Morris. In 2012, he joined IWG Group, which has Regus and Spaces and several other brands. And he joined as country manager in the Philippines, and I think you've been staying in the Philippines ever since. Lars is a big fan of the Philippines. You enjoy yourself there. Today, Lars is overall profit and loss responsible for South Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, and has now also taken over the role of Vice President Sales in ASEAN and South Korea. We can say one thing for sure: Lars is someone who really has the future work at the top of his mind. Probably when you wake up in the morning and when you go to bed, and maybe also in your dreams. Who knows? So we want to encourage questions, Q&A, and anything that you want to ask or that you have you would like to get some insights on or discussion around. There's two options. You can post questions in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and you can also click the raise hand button to ask questions in person. And for those who ask questions in person, we will prioritize you because it's nice to hear other voices and make it more interactive. And Lars will do his presentation first, and then we do a Q&A session after. So with that said, whenever you're ready, Lars, I hope the introduction was in line with expectations.
Thank you very much, Magnus, and thank you for the opportunity to present this afternoon to the members of the Nordic Chamber Indonesia, and I believe also other countries are present in this forum. But fellow Vikings for sure, and by the way, one of the companies that I used to work for, the first one I worked for, who also sent me to Asia, EAC, East Asiatic Company. It doesn't sound very Danish, but it was at that time the largest company in Denmark. It was more than 100 years old. At times we even had a royal family on the board, and the speed of change is a big issue, especially these days, also pertaining to the lessons learned from COVID-19. That huge company, that doesn't even exist today. Things can change very rapidly, and I think we have learned that very much now. Yes, I'm today working for IWG. We are probably better known for our brands, especially Regus, but also Spaces, where I'm also seated in a Spaces center right now, and HQ and Signature and many other brands. We are by far the largest in the world in offering flexible workspace. And we have been doing this for over 30 years. We have about 155 locations just here in Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries, but worldwide 3,500 locations in 1,200 cities, 110 countries. So we have sort of been pioneering this, and we have been going through a lot of interesting times globally, many crises. And it has been interesting to see how the way of working has been impacted every single time, and how providers in our industry have been affected also. One time, and you can see on the slide now, HQ is one of our brands. That was actually a competitor that we acquired after the dot-com bubble burst around year 2000. And on that note, there is a pretty big consolidation in our industry taking place right now too, but maybe a little bit more about that later, because this also pertains very much to some of the countries that you guys are located in. Let me just see here, it doesn't, okay, like that. So going flexible, that was actually already an ongoing trend. I've been talking for the last 10 years about the future of work. And I gotta say that what we were predicting less than 2 years ago is now happening very, very quickly. If we were predicting, and that includes us as a company, but also JLL, CBRE, JP Morgan, were saying that by year 2030, one third of commercial office space would be flexible workspace one way or the other. So no longer just predominantly conventional office space, long-term leases, fixed amount of spaces, head offices in CBD areas. No, what we would see would be that every single new building being turned over would, one way or the other, have the element of flexible workspace, just the way that, for example, we, IWG, are offering it with Regis spaces, etc. Basically, they were saying if you would forget or bypass that element of flexible workspace in a new office building, you might as well have forgotten to put in, say, parking or elevators or a reception, because it would become so crucial. And that is actually now what has been, it's almost like a time machine right now, because of what we are going through, what we are seeing now of forced remote working or hybrid working. But first of all, what is it that has happened? Well, there's not a living soul on this planet who have experienced such a crisis as we are in right now. It is, of course, first and foremost, a health crisis, but it is certainly also a global recession. We have hit a wall, and that literally means it's global. It's everybody, in all individuals, all industries, all businesses, all countries that have hit the exact same wall of lockdowns and COVID-19, as we all know it way too well. This has at the same time basically forced upon us this the biggest flexible working experiment in history. And as our founding CEO, Mark Dixon, says, this will be one of the biggest legacies of COVID-19. Basically, since the introduction of the digital transformation, I mean, our ability to work remotely, that we all are using information technology, being able to access each other that way, that already had created the biggest workspace revolution. But now, the biggest ever since that is really the forced hybrid working from home, working near home. And the thing is, and that's why it's so interesting that you guys, just in that survey that Magnus did, 42% of you said that you are now or will be expected to go back to the office again full time. Because reality is that our research shows that the vast majority of employees, and almost as many in terms of employers, expect that they, at least in part, will be embracing flexible working and not expecting people to report back to work the same way as they did pre-COVID-19. Absolutely conclusive data on that. And the more recent the surveys are, the bigger are the part of employers who are expecting to embrace that at least a part of their workforce should not report back to work the same way as they used to do. So it's quite, I mean, I think we've all been reading about it in the newspapers, and you can see some samples here, but also from social media. I captured one here. This guy writes, "I love you, Dublin, but you are overpriced and gridlocked." Obviously, the guy is from Ireland, and his point is that if he's not expected to be reporting to work every single day the way he used to, he could basically be working out of anywhere within Ireland, and actually anywhere within the same time zone for that matter. So what is happening now, what we see is a lot of companies are now preparing for what will happen post-COVID-19. And what we see is that a typical company that never before had been thinking, at least yet, about embracing flexible workspace and hybrid working, they are now looking, well, first of all, many of them are kicking themselves because they've been paying for many thousands of square meters of office space, and they've been standing empty perhaps for a year or longer now. So shame on them for that, for having to learn it that painful way, that you do not necessarily have to just pay for a huge fixed amount of space. So what they're doing now is they're reviewing their lease agreements for the conventional space. If they have 10 floors in a building today, they might only want to renew their lease for 2 or 3 floors, and then go flexible with the rest. And going flexible with the rest, that can be having office hubs. So they might go in and take flexible workspace, like a couple of offices in the suburbs, in the provinces, where the employees can occasionally report in and go in and close the door behind them. And at the same time, they complement it with memberships. So like in our case, in, say, Malaysia, we have 35 locations in Malaysia. So that means that their employees in Malaysia, they will be able to drop in anytime at any location, any of the 35 locations, which means the locations nearest where people live typically, and work from there, if not going to the office hub because they want to be able to close the door, where it is only with colleagues from their company. And then maybe from time to time go back to that more limited space then that they still might maintain in the CBD area, where they have and then in the future much smaller so-called head office. Now, talking about working hybrid, excellent, but it has also proven to be a challenge. There are challenges. 6 in 10 employees that struggle with internet connectivity, and we see that a lot, especially in this part of the world, that internet, especially from home, is not always that good, that reliable. And when you're working from home and you're competing for internet speed with your children who are also being schooled from home, maybe your spouse is also working from home, it can be very, very difficult. And then in terms of connectivity, and 30% of the workers, they say that their family members or partners or housemates, they are the number one distractor. So they really get disturbed. Here in the Philippines, when we have our Zoom meetings or whatever other platform we are using, the backdrop is often roosters, barking dogs, and occasional sales, food sales cart that is being pushed by. I think many of you will be familiar with that kind of disturbances. And those who are not being disturbed, those are definitely among the 23% who are missing their colleagues and the togetherness and socialization like that. Because if you're not being disturbed at home, very often that results in you becoming lonely instead. And then finally, the 50% of firms that are unable to guarantee that their data is properly protected if they work from home. That can be, for example, banks where firewalls and data protection is absolutely critical, vital, also from a regulatory point of view. But a little bit more about that later. Now, financial agility is key. I think we have to assess this from different angles, get different bearings to see what is to get a fix on what will the future really look like. For the CFOs, this is really, really interesting, because if you before had, say, 10 floors in a building, doesn't matter, but let's say it was 10 floors. Well, before, a traditional office workstation would be vacant 55% of the time. That was pre-COVID-19. Now, already there, the CFO is sort of like starting to see dollar signs, because if he is spending 55% too much fixed expenses on making a capital investment and paying rent every single month, he could basically save those 55%. And as a matter of fact, he can. Then you might say, Lars, what about the day where more than average shows up at the office? Well, that is why every single building needs to have the element of flexibility of shared office space as a service, because then you use that as a buffer. But you can basically, as an average, say 55% already as an average within an average industry. And now, thanks to COVID-19, we will probably go for even bigger savings. And from an HR point of view, it also means a lot more flexibility, because now you can go out and attract employees geographically from a much broader area. I'm working in the Philippines, or I'm based here. Philippines is comprised of 7,107 islands, Indonesia twice that number. I mean, why be limited to try to attract talents, say, in the capital region, where the competition for the good talents is tremendous, and they're very difficult to retain, because everybody are trying to lure them over to their organizations. Now I can actually, by allowing flexible workspace, I can go for talents that are sitting on some of the other 7,106 islands, correct? And that gives the HR a lot more flexibility, and by allowing people to work from home, also being able to, well, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later, but there are other people who you otherwise wouldn't be able to attract, period, into the workforce, who, regardless what you offered them. And from an operational point of view, the preference is to work from home. That translates into the ability to work near home. Basically, employees have wanted this for a very long time. It started like a revolution, a grassroots revolution. It was the younger people, the millennials. They didn't want to be measured by a timesheet. They didn't want to be measured by an old grumpy office manager like myself, who wanted to be able to spot them outside the office. they want to be measured by results and nothing else. So this has really been what the employees have wanted for the longest. Then the employers were starting to embrace it. So it was already a growing trend before COVID-19, but the employers were still choking a bit on it because how to manage these employees when they were working remotely. Well, now they've been forced into this experiment and actually learned that productivity can be tremendous when people are not reporting to the traditional workplace. They just need to have access to an effective place near their home. And that is where they then go to companies like ours that have these networks, not just in the CBD areas, but also in the areas where people work, live, and have been commuting from. And then the macroeconomic effects. And I think this is very important also because when we can offer really good jobs to people living in the provinces, that brings wealth and inclusive growth to the provinces and jobs that normally wouldn't be available to them in the provinces. By allowing people not to have to report to the traditional workplace every single day, it also means that it will help closing the gender gap. Now, I'm based in the Philippines. Philippines is number one in Asia Pacific in terms of closing the gender gap. Actually, they are more advanced, more ahead of even Denmark, my native country, in terms of closing the gender gap. But there are other countries in Southeast Asia that are far behind. The thing is that it is easier to allow part-time jobs, or it's easier to ease people back into the workforce. It could be a mother who have been left the workforce because of pregnancy, etc. Flexible workspace, working from home, hybrid working will be an enabler to ease these people back into the workforce sooner rather than later, or sooner rather than never, by allowing them to work from home, work part-time, just go to a workplace near home, like flexible workspace, the way that we are offering it. And then there are some research, I'm not sharing any slides on it, but how many thousands of tons of CO2, these emissions, because we are usually gridlocked between point A and B, we all, most of us, living in places where pollution is a huge issue. And then finally, the new normal presents big challenges for the traditional offices, and that is for sure, and we see that now. There will be, in order to avoid going back into the same old trap where there's a drop in productivity if we should be forced to go back to the traditional offices. The inflexibility, let's compare it to Uber. Does Uber mean that there are fewer cars on the street at any given time? No, not at all. But it just means that every single car is utilized much better. So what you have for your own office will be hot desking, for your own company, that will be hot desking, and otherwise you will be sharing with everybody else. Magnus and I were talking a little bit about it before, because in the future, I think this type of hybrid working will also, I think eventually we will even be sharing jobs, and we might not necessarily be, we'll be more freelancing and not necessarily just serving one master only. And that's another thing that we will see emerging sooner now. So, but a lot less wasted office space. You will loosen up your balance sheets even, because when you sign up for a conventional lease for 3, 5, 10 years, not only do you make a capital investment into that, the newer accounting rules means that you have to put in as a liability the entire lease obligation for those, say, 10 years. And that hammers your KPIs. It's a big liability. There are no assets to balance that out. And it's not easy at all to explain to your shareholders that kind of liability, why that suddenly is the case. So there is a lot of arguments here that speaks for the future of work being much more flexible, much more hybrid. Let me give you a few hardcore examples here. We had one new customer signing up in February. It was Standard Chartered Bank. They bought from us 95,000 memberships. So they have 95,000 named employees who have a membership on their smartphones, and they can drop into any of our 3,500 locations worldwide. And it's interesting that it is a bank, because remember I talked earlier a little bit about data security. For a bank, it really does not work that people are sitting at home trying to deal with the customer data on a home internet. No, they need to be sitting behind a good, sitting with professional internet connectivity behind a safe firewall. And that can only be provided from a provider such as IWG or other similar providers if they have a firewall. So that is a must. Then a few weeks later, NTT, many of us know NTT as a big telecom company in Japan. Today, they are so much more than just that. They're a huge investor company globally. I believe in Japan, their biggest competitor is actually SoftBank. And they bought 300,000 memberships. So again, they have 300,000 named individuals in their workforce that are now relying on our network for their professional workspace. And these additions have come along within the last, within this calendar year, so within the last 4 months. We have added more than 500,000 users just this year. And it took us more than 30 years to get from the first user to finally have a total of 3.5 million users. And then suddenly we add another 500,000. That is really due diligence of those companies. And now again, keep in mind that 41% of you guys said that you shall report back to the traditional workplace again. Because distributed workforces is actually what we see as an important part of business fight back. And this is how the businesses in our research have responded. 74% of businesses plan to shift some employees to remote working permanently. So when NTT and Standard Chartered and now also Nestle, by the way, are signing up for these thousands of memberships to enable their people to work in a hybrid manner without being forced to sit with the predicaments and the challenges at home, it is not because it is feasible during COVID-19. No, it is because it is feasible after COVID-19. And let me just add here, I'm sure all of you on this call, that you are all, your companies and you as individuals have been very successful up until COVID-19. But during a crisis, the way that you rethink, the way that you reinvent yourself, the way that you re-engineer your businesses, that will also be defining for how well you come out of COVID-19. There's the good old days and there's the good new days, but the new days will never be the way they used to be. So whatever we learn to do different, the way we reinvent, re-engineer our businesses now, that will be defining whether you will just, in best case, survive and come out, but barely get your a fair share of the better times when they come, rather than getting a giant share of the better times when they come back. And the giant share is only taken by those who are doing things differently. And that is why, and I keep saying this, that 74%, that's already an outdated number, because now I've seen that it is 81%. But one thing is for sure, 100% of all businesses will not have the same workspace requirements post-COVID compared to pre-COVID. So again, flexibility. And then I like this statement by Churchill. He said, "Never waste a good crisis." And this was actually said not at the beginning of the war, when he was fighting against the Germans without the Americans yet having joined in. This statement came from him at the time where they had just had the meeting in Malta and were actually preparing for what the world should look like after the war. And if somebody knows a thing or two about a good crisis, it certainly was Winston Churchill. And another thing we also should remember, and I saw this on a title of a book the other day, that whatever got you here will never get you there. And I think that's a very healthy way and a very important way to look at things right now. And with that, I actually only spent that half hour that I expected to spend. So I hope that there's still one or two left out there, and that at least one or two of you will then have some damn good questions. Magnus, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lars. So I invite you now to ask questions using the Q&A box, or press the raise hand button. So don't be shy. And I have a couple of questions just to start the Q&A session here. So very interesting with Nestle, Standard Chartered, and NTT. And what I'm curious about, we know that they now have access to all your offices all over the world, but will they be able to utilize that access? Will they be allowed to basically work from anywhere they want, more or less? I guess it's different answer for each company, right? But
well, I assume you are referring to the COVID-19 situation, and of course, then it all depends on what country you are in and what is the situation. I mean, we are not inviting people in to break whatever the government regulations are prevailing at any given time. But otherwise, yes, they will be able to drop in to any of our locations, because we always have the business lounges, right?
Do you think that these companies, is your impression that they will allow that to, I mean, if we fast forward to when it's possible to travel again,
Yes.
and they have that access, could
Yes,
they
definitely think so. They have, and it has been a very interesting experience for a lot of senior management right now, because they have had to rely on people working from home, and at the same time they have interacted. It has brought them extremely close together. In many ways, it has made the organizations significantly more flat. Actually, I think this is the beginning of the end of the middle management, because suddenly they have realized that they don't need the middle managers to look everybody over their shoulders, or everybody to be measured by that timesheet. They have learned that they are productive, they can be trusted. They just want to enable and facilitate that they actually get the right professional workspace to work in a hybrid manner. And by the way, now, as a semi-joke, at least, calling myself an old stuffy office manager, but if you want to give that old stuffy office manager the nice, warm, fuzzy feeling of still controlling his employees, even without the timesheet and without spotting them outside his office, I can actually tell you who dropped into which location and for how long. And it's a lot better to drop into my lounges than to my biggest competitor, which is the coffee shops, because that always have a very big element of social living, you know, social life. With me, it is more likely to be on a more professional basis. And we actually, of course, check that everybody are allowed in, and thereby they are registered. So again, I can tell you, or Nestle or NTT, who went into which business lounge when and for how long. So you actually have, you enable them to work the way they like, but you still have that kind of control should you have that old-fashioned way of thinking, as some of us do.
I think it's very interesting that these companies are doing that, because they obviously require a certain level of security, and some people I've been talking to about, for example, going to Bali or relocating temporarily, or working more remotely, they say I cannot do it because of security. It's not allowed. And another company, I talked to her in Jakarta, they said that they allow their staff to work from home, but not in a co-working space. That's their policy.
Oh, yeah, but that is, our observation is actually more the opposite. And these companies that are now preparing, and we are talking about typical Fortune 500 companies. I'm dealing with some of the Europe's largest pharmaceuticals, who before had maybe only one office in an entire country with a workforce of more than 500, who would have a lot of field staff who would not be able to ever go to the head office, barely, but they just had to be out in the field, but they were not allowed to work from home at all, not even to do calls or expense reports. They had to be on the go. Well, now there's a very big interest in, well, maybe we can allow them some professional workspace while they are on the go. And clearly, I mean, for me, obviously, it plays right into our hands, but we literally have the help that they need. We have that solution and that help that will enable them to do that.
I think is when we talked a while back, I think you also talked a little bit about how different sectors and different industries, there's some really interesting case studies on how people have handled the crisis, and how other have handled the crisis. And I think you mentioned that several hotels have basically converted themselves into
Yep.
office solution.
Yeah, and we have actually partnered up with a number of hotels. I know some cases in Europe where we are taking over. I think it was in Holland, Netherlands. We took over a few thousand square meters of hotel rooms, and then and that was typically people who where nobody were to go to the office. Period. They don't want to have the entire organization under the same ceiling, in the same building, right? But then you can just tell people, well, go to the hotel there and then take a room. Then they go to the room and the bed is gone, but then there's a desk and there's a coffee maker. There's obviously a washroom too. It's actually quite convenient and nice. And that's the way of thinking that again, remember, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, you need to re-engineer, rethink, reinvent. And that's a great way to do it for a hotel. And of course, we are delighted to partner up with them, because we have the thousands and thousands of inquiries every single day worldwide, right?
Did it then become a part of one of your brands in that case, or was it as
I don't
a?
know exactly how they did it there, because I would assume that it is very short stay and that they do want to convert it back into a hotel afterwards. But I mean, to enter that kind of partnership, again, we have different brands anyway, so we can definitely come up with a solution where we can help them as well. And the more the merrier, because for us it's a matter about number of locations, so that hybrid working, that network is always there. I mean, I'm from Denmark, as mentioned. When the first thing that happens when I when I land in the airport in Copenhagen, is that my phone goes on the Regis network. Why? Because we have a lounge in the airport.
So we have quite a few participants with us here today from Bangkok and Thailand. It will be very interesting to hear some thoughts there on the situation there and the future work, and whether you can work from home going forward there. But it's a little bit hard to know who to invite to speak here. But it will be very interesting to hear some insights there on the ground.
If there are no questions there, I can mention a question I got yesterday on a meeting, Zoom meeting also, and that was how about your competitors coming in? Because, you know, since, I mean, obviously, we are not the only ones who have seen the light, right? I mean, when the companies like Standard Chartered and so on have, then there got to be competitors of ours who have also. Reality is that our competitors today are still the coffee shops, and our competitors are still conventional office space, but they will now increasingly lose out to us. Reality is also that there's a very low barrier to entry into our line of industry. I mean, Magnus, you and I could easily take an office lease out tomorrow, and in the same go hang up a sign that says Magnus Lars co-working. But it is not that easy to manage as soon as you have more than one center, more than one city, make it extreme, more than one country. And a lot of companies were really not making money on it before COVID-19. And being in the eye of the storm, a lot of them are not even making it through. And so we do see right now, just like the dot-com bursting in year 2000, right? And we acquired our biggest competitor in the US, HQ, which is still part of us, right? Then today we also see this kind of consolidations, and I'm sure you don't know this because the press release is not out yet, but in Jakarta, it will be announced here within hours or days, but now you will now hear it for the first time. We are taking over a very significant WeWork location in Jakarta. And that kind of consolidation is happening big time right now in our industry.
So that's a very interesting topic. I mean, speaking about competitors in the US and WeWork. So I watched the documentary, the Hulu documentary about WeWork the other day. And I also read some very interesting articles about WeWork in the last year. I think it's a very, very interesting story, the way it played out. And how do you see competition with them? I guess they're a little bit on the decline side. Yeah.
Where we come in, where we already are distinctly different, is in two respects. Number one, we have the multiple brands, so we don't just cater to that segment where it is free-flowing beer and, you know, the co-working style. That is the cat's meow to one category, but not at all to many other corporate identities. And we cater to many more because we are geographically way spread out, meaning we have not just invested and put all our eggs in where the low-hanging fruit is, meaning the core, the center, ground zero of a CBD area. If you look at, and now I don't want to sit and repeat their name, but if you look at how their revenue was generated before COVID-19, then, for example, in North America, you have very well-known other providers that have maybe 80% of their revenue being generated from less than 5 cities and exclusively in the CBD areas. And that's not where the future is. Who are the real winners right now? It is the provinces. I see it here in the Philippines. It's still very difficult to fly domestically, but there's one very interesting city that you can drive to from Manila. It's Clark. So you don't have to deal with all that domestic flights and that are grounded all the time because of COVID-19. You can just get in the car. And that's booming up there now. People are fleeing. The housing market in in the outskirts, the provinces outside Metro Manila, doing very well.
So for me, it's been very interesting to be in Bali the last few months and talk to some of these digital nomads and freelancers and also some location independent employees, right? Because that's that group, right? It's very well represented there. And many of them are, of course, chasing endless summer. So they just rotate around the world, right? It's rainy season in Bali, we go to Costa Rica, and then we go to Europe in the summer, and then we go back to Bali, right? Can you say a little bit about your strategy there in terms of these like more previously more like vacation areas that are now a place you can actually do your work and make an income and create a life for yourself? South Thailand, Bali, the Philippine Islands, Latin America, these kind of Greek islands, of course.
Yeah.
There's some open locations there.
But now you are saying it, I mean, you're seated in Bali right now in your colorful shirt, and of course, we can all relate. But if there are on this call some very corporate people who are like, well, that's never us, then actually it does what you are describing is applying to almost everybody, because it also means that we know that when we go on vacation even, we do check our emails. You have financial investors and so on, they can never not be on. They need to monitor the markets and everything. I mean, I'm country manager for 5 countries, including Thailand. We have a center in Phuket, right? And that's also needed, very much so. I mean, people, they yes, they are on vacation, but they need a place to drop in and check. And I mean, I never had so much in common with a single generation as I do with the millennials, because when I was their age, my wife used to be very upset at me because I had a telefax machine in my home, back home in Singapore, inside, and I could hear at night when there was a fax ticking in. So even on Saturdays and Sundays, I would have to go and check that telefax. Now, that is the norm now by millennials. They're always on. And we are so also when we are on vacation. So even if you're not that globally roaming surfer, Lala surfer from Lala Land, then you actually, you are one that will be, you know, want to have your leisure, your life, but you can never separate life and work. And therefore we are relevant also on Bali, where we have a very successful center, also in Phuket and so on.
Some other players, they also have gone into the co-living space, some other companies, right? Is that something you have considered?
I'm sure that our founding CEO, Mark Dixon, has considered it, but it is not something that currently is on a rollout basis. And whether it will be or not, honestly, I have no clue. But of course, I hear a lot about it from Bali. I'm also country manager for Vietnam. I hear a lot about it in Vietnam. There are a lot of nomads that are traveling the world, and then they live together in maybe a huge old villa, and then they both sleep and work there.
That's very interesting times. What do you think is the most important skill in these times, Lars, to develop for the future?
It most certainly is the agility, and I'm sorry to use that term because it has become such a buzzword. But it is really what it comes down to: your ability to adapt, your ability to reinvent, your ability to learn. I mean, it is only a few years ago, then even very corporate cultures, they took office with us at, for example, Spaces. Spaces is very much about co-working. We have huge co-working areas that are where I'm seated. We have 700 square meters of one big open co-working area. Then the corporations would come in here because they knew that their employees, they liked it. So then that it was easier for them to attract and retain employees. But now those decision makers, they also want it literally because they need to go out in the co-working environment to learn. They need that interaction with the millennials and Generation Z. So you will see the stuffy guys like me interacting with the young millennials and Generation Z in their white T-shirts and their deliberately huge holes in the blue jeans. But if I don't do that, I will be obsolete very quickly, very quickly. And as you and I just spoke about before this, back in year 1920, that was before I was born, by the way. In 1920, if you were a Fortune 500 company, statistically, you would remain so for 70 years. And today it is statistically barely 10 years you will remain so, either because A, you as a business are not agile, adaptable, you don't keep up, or B, the entire industry, poof, is just obsolete. So that agility is everything. And we don't have the, by the way, none of us have the luxury and of extra time to go back and catch up on the school bench. Just like we have to work on the go, we have to learn on the go. And in order to keep our knowledge and skills current, that kind of interaction is super important. And we don't get it sitting at the traditional office all the time. And we definitely don't get it sitting at home all the time either.
So I think there's so much information these days out there, right? And a lot of it is obviously noise. How do you find a signal in noise? How do you find the information that you take action on? I mean, now with COVID, right? It's a lot of short-term swings and you know, a lot of the short-term effects of COVID will go away, right? After COVID. I mean, how do you interpret and kind of find out what information is reliable and that you should take action on, and what you should actually discard? If you see, do you understand my question?
Yeah, I understand your question. And as always, that is the challenge for good leaders, or that is what defines a good leader, because you need to be very analytical, and that also means quite a bit academic, perhaps, so that you can contain a lot of information, so you keep building up like that. And that is not very actionable, right? Because it just becomes a bigger and broader picture with many more pixels in it. But then you have to sort of like say, okay, now I have enough information. Now I have consulted with enough people, now both internally and externally. As the leader I am, I need to be able to act. So then you boil it down. And then that is then, you know, what is noise and what is not. But you need to make it actionable. So boil it down to those maximum 3 action points, and then just make it very basic and disseminate just that and go with it. And here it is understood that with that due process, you're not going to come up with the same key factors as you had 5 years ago, right? I mean, this is part of reinventing yourself. And we should all the time do this, with or without COVID-19 urging us to do it. It is just that COVID-19 has created such a sudden stop. And everything shows us that when things are moving again, when the wheels start turning again, they turn very fast. If you look at the growth rates in China, GDP are showing almost 20% now. The expectation to global growth this year have been adjusted upwards 3 times. The US are recovering super fast. The last numbers you see are actually GDP growth rates, but the best indicator is actually employment, and employment in the US is booming. I mean, it is way faster that people get back to work than before. And there are, of course, also new industries and new biz that are thriving on this as well. So in many ways, it's a very healthy exercise, because many businesses have had to reinvent themselves and done so successfully. So no doubt that, I mean, there are those that will not survive, so there will be no jobs there. And then there are those that will have been able to redefine themselves, and then they will do so much better afterwards.
Yeah, never waste a good crisis, right? I guess a lot of people have made major career changes and hopefully found a much better, more fulfilling path for themselves in this year. I think that's the case for a lot of people. So I think your presentation was very clear since there was no questions. So
well, your questions were very good. At least the number of people attending didn't drop, so that's always a good sign. Yeah. But I can see our time is also, I feel, well spent. I really appreciate the opportunity. And I hope for another chance to come back and speak on another exciting subject. There sure is plenty of subject matters these days.
I think maybe like after the dust has settled in 1 year, right? It could be also interesting to do another session like this. Then we have more data and the world is moving back to normal, people are vaccinated. It could be really interesting to basically see, okay, what actually is the future of work in a year or something? I don't know.
Well, maybe as a preamble to that, why don't you decide today or now what are the key issues you want to focus on? Which ones could go either way, right? Industries and ways of working and so on. Then make a survey among your members and then see, okay, so this is what the crystal ball looks like. We will reconvene 12 months from now, and then we will reflect on what reality actually is compared to what the crystal ball is looking like according to your members. So maybe you can define what the 5, 7, 8, 10, not too many key areas are that we should reassess when we come out on the other side. And then let's see what the projections are by the members, and then we can see what reality is. I did something similar in a chamber here in the Philippines for New Year. Everybody was like, oh, it's so great, we are getting into year 2021, it can only get better. And I was like, is that really correct? And do they really mean it? So then I sent out a survey with 12 questions, and it turned out it was all bullshit. It's just like Happy New Year, right? Everybody were actually significantly more pessimistic than what they sounded like. So it's kind of interesting to get the projections, and that survey I then tabulated so that come January 2022 with that chamber, we will then see how right or wrong we were.
That's a very good idea, actually, like a New Year, predictions for the New Year, right?
I did that first time in 1990, entering year 1991, sitting with my friends in Tokyo. One of them had a dad visiting a journalist from New York, so he helped with some of the questions. And one of the questions was, will Fidel Castro still be in power 1 year from now? We all said, no way. I mean, it's really fun to see 1 year later, and I can even remember 20 years later how wrong or how right we were.
I think this reminds me of the quote. There's some kind of quote, right? Projections are hard, especially about the future. Or predictions are hard.
Predict especially about the future.
Exactly.
That's a good note to end this on.
Let's give it a go anyways. Thank you so much, Lars. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. My pleasure as always. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.